He branded his pregnant Luna a traitor. 17 years later, their twin sons returned to claim his throne. The silver iron pressed against Nora's wrist before she could say another word. She did not scream. She refused to. Even as the pain shot up her arm like lightning cracking through stone, she kept her eyes on the man holding it. The man she had loved for 6 years. The man who had chosen her above every other woman in Hartwell Pack. The man who was now looking at her like she was a stranger he wished he had never met. Alpha Cole Hartwell did not flinch. He pressed the iron in the shape of 2 crossed lines, the mark that every member of Hartwell Pack knew on sight, the mark of a traitor. He held it there for 3 long seconds, long enough to make the scar permanent, long enough to make sure every single person standing in that great hall would see it and remember. Then he pulled it back, dropped it on the floor, and stepped away from her. "You are no longer Luna of this pack," he said, loud enough for all 300 wolves standing in that hall to hear. "You are no longer my mate. You leave tonight. You do not come back." Nora stood straight. Her wrist was burning. Her heart was worse, but she did not collapse, did not beg, did not lower her eyes. She looked at Cole for one more moment, searching his face for even a flicker of doubt, a single crack in that hard expression. There was nothing. His jaw was set. His eyes were cold. He had already made up his mind long before he called this assembly. She turned around and walked out of the hall. 300 wolves parted to let her through. None of them spoke. Some looked at the floor. A few of the older women pressed their hands to their mouths. One of the elders, a gray-haired man named Gerald who had known Nora since she first came to Hartwell, took one small step toward her, then stopped himself. His hands were shaking. Nora walked through the doors, across the stone courtyard, and out into the cold night air. Only when she was far enough from the hall, deep enough into the tree line that no one could see her, did she let herself stop. She pressed her back against a thick oak and slid slowly to the ground, holding her burned wrist against her chest. She stared up through the branches at the sky. The moon was full and white and completely indifferent. She was 3 months pregnant. She had not told Cole yet. She had been waiting for the right moment, the quiet evening she had planned for the following week, the candles she had already bought, the way she had rehearsed telling him. None of that was going to happen now. She pressed her free hand flat against her stomach. Whatever happened next, she was not going to fall apart here in the dirt. Cole Hartwell had not always been a hard man. There were people in Hartwell Pack who remembered him differently, the young alpha who used to sit with the pack's elderly members during winter festivals, who once carried an injured wolf on his back for 2 miles rather than wait for help to arrive. He had been sharp, but not cruel, firm, but not cold. Nora had seen both sides of him. She had loved the warmth underneath the authority. She had believed, without question, that he trusted her the same way she trusted him. She had been wrong about that. Not about his feelings, perhaps, but about the depth of his faith in her when things got difficult. It had started 4 weeks earlier with a man named Philip Graves. Philip was the beta of Fernwood Pack, a neighboring territory that had been at odds with Hartwell for nearly a decade. The tension between the 2 packs had been building steadily, fueled by old land disputes and newer arguments over trade routes. Cole had made it clear more than once that he had no interest in sitting across a table from Fernwood's leadership. But Nora had been listening. She had been watching the cost of that tension on both sides. The young wolves who lived near the border, who could not sleep without one ear open. The families who had stopped letting their children play in the fields that ran along the boundary line. She had been quietly gathering information, speaking to neutral pack representatives, reading letters from wolves on both sides who wanted an end to the hostility but had no idea how to start. Philip Graves had reached out to her directly. Not as a threat, not as manipulation, but as a genuine offer to begin quiet negotiations that could eventually lead to a formal meeting between Cole and Fernwood's Alpha. He had chosen to contact Nora because everyone knew she was reasonable, because her reputation as someone who listened before she spoke had reached beyond Hartwell's borders. Nora had agreed to meet him. She had met Philip 3 times, always in neutral territory, always in daylight, always with at least one trusted witness present, a healer named Gwen, who had no allegiance to either pack. The meetings were structured, careful, and entirely focused on building a path toward peace. Nora had taken detailed notes. She had planned to present everything to Cole once the framework was solid enough to be worth his time. She never got the chance. Someone had seen her at the second meeting. Not Gwen. Someone else. Someone who had not stayed to watch long enough to understand the context. That someone had gone straight to Cole with the simplest version of what they had seen. His Luna meeting privately with the Fernwood Beta. Cole had not come to her. He had not asked. He had spent 2 weeks gathering what he called evidence, which was really just a collection of sightings from people who knew even less than the first witness. He had built a case in his own mind, stone by stone, and by the time he called the assembly, the verdict was already decided. He did not tell her she was accused until she was standing in front of 300 wolves with nowhere to go. She had tried to speak. He had raised his hand and told her the evidence was sufficient. He had told the assembly that a Luna who met secretly with a rival pack had already chosen her loyalties. He had told them that betrayal at that level could not be tolerated. Not now, not ever, not by him. And then he had picked up the iron, sitting against the oak tree with her burned wrist and her unborn children and the ruins of everything she had built in Hartwell Pack. Nora made one decision. She was going to survive this. Not out of spite, though she would not pretend that the anger sitting in her chest was not real. Not out of hope that Cole would one day understand what he had done, though she could not fully extinguish that hope either. She was going to survive this because the 2 small lives growing inside her had not done anything wrong, had not chosen any of this, and they deserved a mother who was still standing when they came into the world. She got up off the ground. She walked to the small house she shared with Cole, or had shared until an hour ago. She packed one bag. She took her personal documents, her healer's kit, her mother's ring, and a photograph of the 2 of them from the first year they were together, not because she wanted to look at it, but because it was the only photograph she had where she looked truly happy, and she thought someday she might need the reminder that she was capable of that. She left the Hartwell ceremonial chain she had been given when she was named Luna on the table. She left the candles she had bought for the dinner she would never have. She walked out of the house and did not look back. By dawn, she was 40 miles from Hartwell territory, sitting on a bus that smelled like old coffee and worn leather, heading north toward a town she had visited once as a child and remembered mostly for its quiet. The town was called Millhaven. It sat in a valley between 2 low mountain ranges, far enough from any pack's claimed territory to be considered neutral ground. Wolves who lived there had chosen to live outside pack structure, some by necessity, some by preference. No one asked too many questions in Millhaven. No one wore their pack history on their sleeve. Nora pressed her forehead against the cold bus window and watched the dark landscape slide past. She thought about Cole. She thought about how certain his face had looked when he pressed that iron against her wrist. She thought about the way he had not even let her speak, had not given her 30 seconds to explain, had not afforded her the basic dignity of being heard after 6 years of complete loyalty. She had loved that man with everything she had, and he had looked at her like a problem he was glad to be done with. She did not cry on the bus. She was saving that for later, for a place where she could afford to fall apart properly, and then put herself back together without an audience. She had learned a long time ago that grief was real work, and it deserved privacy. She arrived in Millhaven just as the morning light was beginning to turn the mountain peaks pink. She found a small guest house run by an older woman named June, who charged reasonable rates and did not ask for more than a first name and payment in advance. Nora paid for 2 weeks. Then she went upstairs, locked the door, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and finally let herself cry. She cried for a long time. When she was done, she washed her face, pressed a clean cloth against her still healing wrist, and opened the window to let in the cold mountain air. Then she opened her notebook, found a clean page, and began to write. At the top of the page, she wrote 2 words and underlined them twice. Start over. Below that, she began to plan. She was 27 years old. She was a trained healer with a decade of practice. She had enough savings to last 6 months if she was careful. She had no pack, no title, and no mate. She had a scar on her wrist that would mark her for the rest of her life, and 2 children who would arrive in roughly 6 months, and who would need a home, a community, and a mother who had not given up. She turned to a fresh page and wrote 2 names that came to her without warning, from some quiet place deep inside her that had apparently already been working on this, while the rest of her was falling apart. Callum and Owen. She did not question where the names came from. She just wrote them down and looked at them for a while and felt for the first time since that iron had touched her skin, that something ahead of her was worth moving toward. Outside, Millhaven was waking up. She could hear the distant sound of a market setting up, someone calling out to a neighbor, the low rumble of a cart on cobblestones. Life continuing, indifferent and ordinary, and exactly what she needed. She closed the notebook. She had work to do. Nora did not waste a single morning in Millhaven feeling sorry for herself. She had already given grief its time, its proper hours in the dark, and now she was done with that. There was too much ahead of her to spend energy looking backward. She found a small house to rent within her first 2 weeks, a 2-bedroom place at the edge of town with a garden that backed onto a narrow stream and a kitchen large enough to dry herbs and mix remedies. The landlord was a quiet man named Henry, who charged fair rent and fixed things without being asked. Nora paid her first month and set to work making the place livable. She hung her healer's tools on a wooden rack above the kitchen counter. She planted lavender and yarrow and feverfew along the garden wall. She introduced herself to her neighbors on both sides, a retired couple who kept chickens, and a young woman named Claire who worked at the Valley Pharmacy, and who, within 3 days, had become the closest thing Nora had to a friend in this new place. Claire was sharp and funny and did not pry. When she noticed Nora's wrist scar on their second meeting, she looked at it for only a moment and then looked away, the way a person does when they recognize that something serious happened and have decided it is not their place to ask. She never brought it up. She never offered Nora the kind of cautious sympathy that would have required Nora to perform a version of her story she was not ready to tell. She simply continued being a good neighbor, which was the most useful thing anyone had offered Nora in a long time. Nora liked her for it immediately and kept liking her. Nora began offering healer services to the Millhaven community within her first month. Word spread fast in small towns, especially when the healer was genuinely skilled. She had trained for years and had handled everything from broken bones to infections to the kind of deep exhaustion that no medicine could fully touch, but that careful hands and the right remedies could ease considerably. People came to her cottage in the morning and left feeling better than when they had arrived. She was honest about her prices and offered reduced rates to those who could not afford the full amount. Within 3 months, she was known throughout Millhaven. Within 6, she had more patients than she could comfortably manage alone, and had started talking to Claire about whether a part-time assistant might be worth considering. Her pregnancy progressed quietly. She attended her checkups at the Valley Clinic, where a calm doctor named Dr. Halford, who had the manner of someone who had seen everything and been startled by nothing, confirmed that she was carrying twins, that both were growing well, and that she should eat more iron-rich foods and sleep on her side. She told no one in Millhaven who their father was. She introduced herself as Nora Vale, using her mother's family name rather than the Hartwell name she had carried for 6 years. No one connected her to the Hartwell pack, which was far enough away and private enough in its affairs that its internal matters rarely reached neutral territories. The boys arrived on a cold morning in late autumn, 3 weeks early but strong. Callum came first, loud and furious about the whole situation, his eyes open almost immediately, staring at the ceiling of the clinic room with an expression of profound suspicion. Owen came 4 minutes later, quieter, watchful, looking up at Nora from the first second as if he was already filing information away for later use. Nora held one in each arm and looked at them for a long time without speaking. She was aware of her burned wrist, of the 2 crossed lines that marked her skin, and she made a decision in that moment that she would tell these boys the truth when they were old enough to hear it. All of it. Not a softened version. Not a version designed to protect Cole's image or her own pride. The truth, plainly told, because they deserved to understand where they came from and who had shaped the circumstances of their beginning. She took them home to the house by the stream 3 days later. Claire had hung a simple wreath on the front door, while Nora was in the clinic. There was a pot of soup on the stove and clean towels folded on the kitchen table. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment, with a baby in each arm, and felt something shift inside her, something that was not quite happiness yet, but was closer to it than anything she had felt in months. The years in Millhaven were not easy. They were not meant to be. 2 children alone, in a rented house, on a healer's income, in a small valley town, was a life that required constant attention and offered very little margin for mistakes. Nora managed it the same way she managed everything, with careful planning honest effort, and the refusal to pretend that things were fine when they were not. Callum and Owen grew fast. Callum was everything Nora had expected from that first furious cry. Bold, direct, quick to speak, the kind of child who walked into a room as though he had already decided he belonged there. He was never unkind about it. There was no cruelty in him. But there was a natural authority that showed up early and never left. He made friends easily because people felt steady around him, which was a strange thing to feel around a child, but it was consistently true. Owen was different, in the way that made people look twice. He was quieter than his brother, more observant. The one who would sit at the edge of a conversation and say nothing for an hour, and then ask the one question that cut straight to the heart of whatever everyone else had been dancing around. He read everything he could get his hands on. He had a memory that was genuinely striking, not because it was unusual in kind, but because he used it with such precision and at such unexpected moments. Together, they were something that Millhaven noticed and talked about in the careful, respectful way that small communities talk about children who are clearly going to be something significant in the world. Their teachers noticed. The families who came to Nora's healer cottage noticed the two serious, capable boys who sometimes helped their mother sort herbs and who always addressed adults with respect but never with nervousness. Nora taught them everything she could. She taught them healer work and plant knowledge and how to read a person's face for what they were not saying. She taught them history, the real kind, the kind that included mistakes and their consequences. She taught them the laws of the wolf world, pack structure, alpha rights, elder councils, and the ancient codes that governed succession and challenge. She taught them about Hartwell Pack. Not all at once. It came gradually, over years, in pieces sized appropriately for where they were in their understanding. She told them about Cole when Callum was 8 and had asked, with the directness that was his defining quality, why their father had never come to find them. She sat both boys down at the kitchen table and told them the truth. She told it plainly and without embellishment, and when she was done, she showed them the scar on her wrist, the two crossed lines that had never fully faded, and she explained what it meant and how it had come to be there. Callum had stared at the scar for a long time. Then he had said, "He did not even listen to you?" "No," Nora had said. "He did not." Owen had said nothing for a while. Then he had asked, quietly, "Does he know about us?" "No." Another silence. Then Owen had nodded slowly, as if he was placing something carefully into a mental file to be examined more thoroughly at a later point in his life. She had watched them grow up carrying that knowledge, and had been grateful, every single time, that they did not let it make them hard. There had been moments when she had wondered about this, whether the truth had been too much too early, whether the weight of it would bend them in some direction she could not correct. It never did. They carried it the way she had hoped they would, as information rather than injury, as something that explained where they came from without defining where they were going. Callum was angry about it sometimes, the kind of clean anger that comes from an honest understanding of injustice, but he did not let it define him. Owen was more philosophical, though Nora sometimes caught him looking at nothing in particular, with an expression she could not fully read, and suspected was more complex than he let on. Back in Hartwell Pack, the consequences of Cole's decision had been arriving steadily, like bills for a debt he had not known he was taking on. The peace framework that Nora had been building with Philip Graves collapsed completely within a month of her exile. Philip had reached out once more, to Cole directly, and had been met with such sharp hostility that Fernwood had withdrawn from all further contact. The border tensions escalated into open confrontation 8 months later, a series of conflicts that cost both packs resources and left 3 wolves from Hartwell with serious injuries that changed the shape of their lives permanently. Cole had managed it. He was still an alpha, still capable, still respected in the broader wolf world. But Hartwell Pack was quieter and smaller and less connected than it had been during Nora's time as Luna. Several families had quietly relocated to other territories in the years following the exile. Not dramatically, not in any visible act of protest, but in the way that people gradually leave a place when they feel that something essential has gone wrong at its foundation. The older members remembered Nora. Gerald, the elder who had started to step forward on the night of her exile and had then stopped himself, had never forgiven himself for that small, irreversible failure. He carried it like a stone in his pocket, small enough to ignore most of the time, heavy enough to always be felt. Cole had never taken another Luna. There were people in the pack who interpreted this as guilt. There were others who thought it was pride, that he refused to replace what he had so publicly taken away as a matter of personal stubbornness that had nowhere left to go. Cole himself could not have given a clean answer. The truth was that he had discovered the reality of what Nora had been doing about 18 months after her exile, when a neutral territory representative had shown him the written record of her meetings with Philip Graves, the detailed notes she had kept, the framework she had been building entirely on his behalf and for the benefit of his pack. He had read those notes alone in his office, late at night, with the rest of the pack house dark and quiet around him, and he had sat very still for a very long time afterward. He had never spoken about it publicly. He had never sent word to Nora, partly because he did not know where she was, and partly because he did not believe an apology was sufficient, and partly because some part of him could not yet face what a genuine apology would require him to admit about the kind of man he had been in that moment. He had looked for her quietly, over the years. He had used what connections he had in neutral territories, asked careful questions through intermediaries, followed threads that led nowhere or ended abruptly. He told himself it was about accountability, about making something right for the pack's honor and record. He did not let himself look too closely at the other reasons, the ones that surfaced in the early hours of the morning when his defenses were down and the house was very quiet. He did not find her. Nora had become Nora Vale in Millhaven, a healer in a valley town far from Hartwell's reach, and she had built a life so grounded and solid and genuinely her own that she was not findable unless she chose to be. She did not choose to be found, not for 17 years. The call came from Callum on a Tuesday evening, while Nora was sitting at the kitchen table, going through her supply list. She had been expecting something like this in some form, not this specific shape exactly, not these precise words, but she had known for 2 years that the boys were getting close to a decision. She had watched them become men who were fully themselves, capable and steady, and completely clear-eyed about what had been done to their family. She had known that Clarity would eventually want to move somewhere, that it would need a direction. Callum said, "We have been talking, Owen and me. We have decided we are going to Hartwell." Nora set down her pen. "I know," she said. There was a pause on the line. Then Callum said, with that same directness that had never changed from the 8-year-old boy sitting across the kitchen table asking hard questions, "You are not going to try to stop us." It was not a question. "No," said Nora. "I am not." She heard Owen's voice in the background, a quiet comment she could not fully make out, and then Callum said, "We will call you when we arrive." She sat for a long time after the call ended, her hands flat on the table, the supply list forgotten beside them. She looked at the scar on her wrist, the 2 crossed lines, white now against her skin, permanent as everything that had led to them. She thought about her sons, who were now men, who had their father's jaw and her eyes, and a right to their history that no one could legitimately deny them. She thought about Hartwell, about the hall, about Cole's face on that night, 17 years ago. She thought about the bus and the cold window and the notebook with the 2 names written carefully on a fresh page. Then she got up, put the kettle on, and waited for the call that would tell her the next part of the story had finally begun. Callum drove and Owen navigated, which was how they had always done things on every long journey they had taken together. It was not that Owen could not drive, or that Callum could not read a map. It was simply that they had discovered early on that this division worked well, that Callum's need to be doing something with his hands matched Owen's need to be the one watching for what lay ahead. Some arrangements between people are not discussed because they do not need to be. They simply settle into place over time and stay there because they fit. They had left Millhaven before dawn. The mountain roads were empty at that hour, and the valley was still dark below them when they reached the first long stretch of highway heading south. Callum drove steadily. Owen tracked the route on his phone and said almost nothing for the first 2 hours. Then Owen said, "She knew we were going before we told her." "Of course she knew," Callum said. "She has always known things before we say them." "She did not try to prepare us differently." "No, that means she trusts what we already have." Owen was quiet again. Outside the window, the landscape was changing, the mountains falling away behind them, the terrain flattening into the wider, lower country of the south. Farms appeared, and then small towns, and then the long stretches of forest that marked the beginning of the territories. Callum said, without looking away from the road. Are you nervous? Owen considered this honestly. Yes, he said, but not the kind of nervous that makes you stop. The kind that means what you are doing is real. Callum nodded. That was exactly right. They were crossing into territory now. Old border country. The kind of land that had invisible lines running through it, that you could not see, but could, if you were what they were, absolutely feel. The air changed here. The trees were different, older, heavier, with a kind of presence that had nothing to do with the weather, and everything to do with the fact that this land had been held and shaped and claimed by the same bloodline for 4 generations. Hartwell blood. Their blood. Callum felt it in his chest, like hearing a word you have read many times but never heard spoken aloud. It was familiar and strange in the same breath, and it made something in him go very still, in a way that was not fear, but was serious and deep and required acknowledgement. Owen had gone very still beside him too. He was looking out at the trees with an expression Callum knew well. The one that meant something was registering below the level of thought, in some part of a person that does not use words. Feel it? Oh, Callum said. Yes, said Owen. He said nothing else, because there was nothing else to add. Owen said quietly, a few minutes later. There. He was pointing ahead at the tree line, where the road curved. 2 wolves were standing at the edge of the forest, not in any threatening posture, simply standing and watching. They had seen the car. They were not moving toward it, and they were not moving away. Callum did not slow down. He kept the same steady speed and drove through the curve. He looked at the 2 border wolves as he passed, met their eyes without dropping his gaze, and kept moving without hesitation. In the side mirror, he saw them turn. One of them had already raised a phone to his ear. Good. Let them call ahead. The pack house was another 8 kilometers in. The road became narrower and rougher as they went deeper into the territory, the trees pressing in on both sides, old and dense, and carrying their age in their silence. Callum drove through it without slowing. They came around a wide bend and the pack house came into view. It was large and old and built from dark stone. It sat at the top of a shallow rise, surrounded by broad, cleared ground on all sides. The smaller buildings arranged behind it spoke of a community that had occupied this land for a very long time. Nora had described it to them once. The great hall, the high ceiling, the long stone floor, the quality of the light. She had described it with accuracy, and without decoration, because accuracy was its own kind of respect for what had happened there. Callum parked the car at the edge of the clearing. He sat for one moment with his hands still on the wheel, not from hesitation, from the simple need to be fully present before he stepped out, to let what was about to happen be real to him before it began. He had been moving toward this his entire life in ways he had not always had words for. Now he was here. He wanted to feel it properly. Then he opened the door. There were wolves outside already, moving with the controlled urgency that meant information was traveling fast through the community. He could see them adjusting positions, some moving closer, some moving to the sides, the way a crowd does when it knows something significant is approaching and has not yet decided how to respond to it or what face to present. There was no hostility in it. There was caution, and there was something else, something harder to name, something that felt like a community holding itself still while it worked out what it was feeling. He and Owen got out of the car at the same moment. The effect was immediate. It moved through the gathered wolves like a current running through still water, a ripple that started at the nearest wolves and extended outward through the crowd until everyone present had felt it. Callum had experienced his own presence most of his life, the way rooms adjusted around him without quite knowing why, the way people became slightly more careful and slightly more attentive in his company. He was used to that. What he was not prepared for was what happened when he stood beside Owen, both of them looking at the same point, with the same clarity and the same certainty, and the full combined weight of what they were hit, the assembled wolves all at once. Nobody challenged them. Nobody stepped back. But the silence that descended was so complete, it had a physical texture, the kind of silence that happens when a crowd of people all decide simultaneously to listen before they speak. An older man came through the front doors of the pack house, gray-haired, straight-backed, with the face of someone who had spent decades carrying the weight of decisions he could not undo and choices he could not unmake. He stopped on the stone steps and looked at them. He looked at them for a long time, long enough that the people nearest him began to glance at his face, and then back at the twins, and then back at him again, reading his expression for information. Then he said, almost to himself and to no one in particular, she had sons. His voice was rough with something that was not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood and had been living there for 17 years. He was not speaking to them exactly. He was speaking to the air, to the years, to the accounting that had been building inside him since the night he had taken one small step toward Nora Vale, and then, out of fear and uncertainty, stopped himself and let her walk away. Callum spoke first. His voice carried across the clearing without effort. Not because he raised it, but because it was the kind of voice that moved through space cleanly and landed exactly where it was directed. We are Callum and Owen Vale, sons of Nora Vale, your former Luna. We are also the sons of Alpha Cole Hartwell, which gives us standing under pack law to be on this land and to be heard. We are asking to speak to the Alpha. The old man, who Callum would later learn was Gerald, looked at them for another long moment. Then he said simply, "Come inside." They followed him into the great hall. It was exactly as Nora had described it. High ceiling, long stone floor, the particular quality of afternoon light that came through tall windows in flat golden shafts. It smelled of old wood and stone, and the accumulated presence of generations of wolves, who had gathered in this space for every occasion that mattered, every birth and death and decision and reckoning that had shaped the pack across the years. Cole Hartwell was standing at the far end of the hall. He was taller than Callum had imagined from the descriptions. Broader, he had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that was exactly the jaw Callum saw in his own mirror every single morning of his life, and eyes that were currently doing the thing that happens to a person's eyes when they are confronted with something they have known was coming for years, and still find themselves not quite ready for at the actual moment of its arrival. He went completely still. Callum and Owen walked the full length of the hall and stopped 6 feet from him. The distance was deliberate, close enough to be direct, far enough to leave Cole the space to respond without feeling cornered. Owen said nothing. He was watching Cole with the quiet, deliberate attention that meant he was processing everything visible and audible and storing it carefully for later use. Cole looked at Callum, then he looked at Owen. Then he looked at Callum again, and in that second look, Callum watched his father understand, fully and without any remaining way around it, what he was standing in front of. Not 2 young wolves making a legal claim, his sons. His children, grown into men, standing before him with their mother's eyes and his blood and 17 years of distance between them that neither of them had chosen. Cole said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, in a voice that was not as steady as it had been moments before, "How is she?" It was not what Callum had expected him to say first. He glanced at Owen briefly. Owen gave him nothing, which meant Owen was giving Callum the space to decide how to answer, and wanted to hear what he would choose. "She is well," Callum said. "She built a good life. She did not need anyone's help to do it." Cole accepted this without flinching. He nodded once, a small and honest nod. Then he said, "Why are you here?" Callum reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a folded document. He had prepared it carefully over 3 months, with Owen's thorough help, cross-referenced against every version of pack law he had been able to locate from every source available to him in Millhaven and in the Neutral Territory archives. He unfolded it and held it out. "Pack law," he said, "gives the Alpha's firstborn sons the right to request a full review of pack leadership and to petition for an elder council hearing on questions of succession. We are exercising that right." Cole took the document. He read it. His expression did not change in any way that was easy to name, but something behind his eyes shifted, some last resistance giving way to something that looked more like exhaustion, meeting honesty than anything else. Around the hall, wolves had gathered. Word had moved fast, the way it always moved inside a pack, person to person, and breath to breath, and the invisible connection of a community that shared something deeper than language. The room was nearly full now, quietly full, the kind of full that meant people understood this was a moment that would be discussed and remembered for a generation, and were doing their best to pay attention to all of it at once. Gerald spoke from his position near the wall. His voice was steady in the way that a very old man's voice can be when he has finally, after a very long time, decided that this is the moment he will not stay quiet. The boys are right, Gerald said. Pack law is clear on this point. An elder council can be convened within 3 days of a formal petition. The alpha cannot refuse the petition if it has been properly filed. He paused and looked at Cole directly, holding his gaze without apology. It has been properly filed. Cole looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at him with the expression of a man who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and was relieved, whatever came next, to finally be setting it down. Cole looked at the document in his hands. Then he looked at his sons, standing in the hall their ancestors had built, with their mother's patience and his own blood, and the absolute certainty of people who have prepared thoroughly for something they know is right. 3 days, he said. The council will be convened. Owen spoke for the first time since they had entered the hall. His voice was quiet, measured, and completely certain. We also want to know whether you have read the notes that Nora kept from her meetings with the Fernwood Beta. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It had a sharper quality. It meant that people in the room already knew something about the answer, had suspected the truth for years, and were watching Cole to see what he would do when the question was put to him directly and in front of everyone. Cole said, "Yes, I have read them." "When did you read them?" "About 18 months after she left." Owen nodded slowly. That single quiet nod contained everything it needed to. "Then you have known for 15.5 years, Owen said, "that you were wrong." It was not a question, and it was not delivered with heat. It was a statement of fact, in the same tone Owen used for every statement of fact, which somehow made it more precise and more devastating than anger would have been. Cole said, "Yes." The word fell into the hall like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved outward through the assembled wolves, slowly and without hurry. The 3 days before the Elder Council convened were unlike anything Hartwell Pack had lived through in recent memory. The twins moved through the territory with purpose, not with hostility, and not with performance. They went where they needed to go, spoke to the people who came to them, and let the pack form its own understanding of who they were, without pushing the process in any direction. On the first evening, Gerald came to find them in the small room off the main hall. He sat down without preamble and told them what he had seen on the night of Nora's exile and what he had failed to do. He did not minimize it or explain it away. He told it plainly, the way a person tells something they have been carrying alone for too long, and when he was finished, he looked at Owen with the expression of someone who needed the truth more than he needed to be forgiven. Owen said, "She never blamed the pack as a whole, only the decision." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Something in his face changed in a way that suggested those words had landed in a specific and important place inside him. On the second day, Callum walked to the far edge of the territory, where the boundary ran along a ridge of low hills. He stood at the line for a long time, looking at ordinary, unremarkable land that had been the source of so much that should never have happened. Suffering had come to both packs from the failure to resolve what this land represented, and it had been entirely preventable. He stood there until he had said everything he needed to say to himself about it. Then he walked back. On the third morning, Cole found Owen in the garden before the council convened. It was early, the sun barely over the tree line, the air still cold enough to see breath. They stood on opposite sides of the gate for a moment before Cole spoke. "I am going to stand before the council today," he said, "and I am not going to say anything that is not true. I want you to know that before we go in." Owen looked at him with the same steady attention he gave everything. He did not fill the silence immediately. He considered the statement the way he considered all statements, for what it contained and what it did not. "I know," he said. "We have been watching you for 3 days. I know." Cole nodded once. Then he walked back inside without adding anything further. Owen stood in the garden for a moment afterward, looking at the plants along the stone wall, noting what was overgrown and what had been neglected, and what was still, in spite of everything, doing what it was meant to do. He wrote something in his notebook, then he closed it and went in. Philip Graves arrived the following morning, having traveled through the night after receiving Owen's message. He came without ceremony and without a large company, just himself and one quiet companion, and he shook hands with both twins in the courtyard, with the straightforward manner of a man who was relieved to finally be in a room where the full truth was welcome. The 3 days before the Elder Council were the most closely watched days Hartwell Pack had experienced in a generation. Nothing quite like this had ever happened here, not within living memory. The arrival of the Alpha's unknown sons, the formal petition, Cole's public acknowledgement in the Great Hall that he had been wrong, all of it moved through the pack with the force of something long overdue, finally breaking free of what had been holding it in place. People talked, and they had to talk. 17 years of carefully not discussing what had happened to Nora had built up a pressure that the twins' arrival had released all at once. The older members talked about the night of the exile, about what they had seen, about what they had thought and not said. The younger members, who had grown up in a pack shaped by that night's consequences, without fully understanding the cause, were now putting pieces together that had never been arranged in front of them before. Callum and Owen moved through the pack for 3 days, with their eyes open, and their assessments forming quietly and continuously. They walked the territory, spoke with the people who approached them, and listened far more than they spoke. They were learning what this place was and what it had become, the specific shape of 17 years of a decision that should never have been made. On the first evening, Gerald came to find them. He sat with them in the small common room off the main hall and told them, in plain and careful words, what he had seen on the night of Nora's exile and what he had failed to do. He did not spare himself in the telling. He told them about the step toward her that he had taken and then not taken, and he told them that he had thought about that moment almost every day for 17 years, and that seeing them here was the first time in all those years that he had felt the weight of it begin to lift. Owen listened to all of it with complete attention. Then he said, "She never blamed the pack as a whole, only the decision." Gerald nodded. He looked like that distinction mattered deeply to him. On the second day, Callum walked to the far edge of the territory, where the fernwood border ran along a ridge of low hills. He stood at the line for a while, looking out at the land that had been the source of the conflict Nora had been trying to resolve when everything fell apart. It was quiet land, ordinary land, the kind of place where the idea that people had suffered for it seemed almost impossible to reconcile with how unremarkable it looked. But suffering had happened here, on both sides, because one man had refused to listen to the woman trying to prevent it. He stood there for a while, and then walked back. On the morning of the third day, before the council was called to session, Cole found Owen in the garden at the back of the pack house. Owen was standing near the stone wall, looking at the overgrown herbs growing along it, with the expression of someone cataloging information. Cole stopped a few feet away. He was not sure what he wanted to say, and was honest enough with himself not to pretend otherwise. Owen looked at him. He did not make it easy, but he did not make it hard either. He simply waited. Cole said, "Your mother named you both herself." "Yes. She chose good names." Owen said, "She chose everything well. That was always who she was." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am going to stand before the council today, and I am not going to say anything that is not true. I want you to know that, before we go in." Owen looked at him for a long moment. "I know," he said. "We have been watching you for 3 days. I know." The Elder Council convened in the Great Hall on the third morning. Every adult member of Hartwell Pack who was able to be present had come. They filled the room to the walls, standing 3 deep along the sides and back, the older and more senior members seated in the arc of chairs that the elders had arranged around a central open space. The light came through the tall windows in long, clean bars. The room was as quiet as it had been on that other night, the night everyone in it who had been alive then was thinking about. Callum and Owen sat across from Cole. Philip sat to one side, composed and present. The 7 elders sat at the center. The eldest of the elders, a woman named Agatha, who had held her position for 30 years, and who had the manner of someone who had heard every possible version of human failure and still believed in the genuine possibility of people doing better, called the council to order without delay. This council has been convened under pack law to review the circumstances of the exile of Nora Vale, formerly Luna of Hartwell Pack, and to consider the petition filed by Callum and Owen Vale regarding leadership and succession, she said. Her voice was clear and did not waver for a single word. "We will hear from all parties. We will follow the truth wherever it goes. We begin." Philip spoke first. He was a careful man, shaped by years of watching negotiations succeed and fail, based on whether or not the people in the room were willing to deal in exact truths. He had brought documentation, the same kind of careful written record that Nora had kept, logs of their meetings with dates and locations and witness names. He laid it on the table before the elders and walked through it in sequence. He described Nora's approach to him, what she had proposed, and why. He described her goals, which had been entirely focused on creating a genuine path to peace between two packs that had been hurting each other and themselves for far too long. He described the structure of their meetings, the neutral ground, the healer Gwen as witness, the notes Nora had taken after every session. She was doing something for this pack and this alpha that he had not asked her to do, Philip said, because she could see that it was needed and she had the skill and the relationships to begin building it. She was doing it quietly, because she understood the alpha well enough to know that he would need to see a working framework before he would agree to come to the table. She knew him. She was right about that, and she was trying to use that knowledge to protect him and his people. He paused. The conflict that followed her exile cost both our packs significantly. It did not need to happen. A partial agreement was eventually reached 7 years later, brokered without Hartwell's alpha, because enough people on both sides were simply tired of paying for something that could have been prevented before it ever started. Agatha thanked him and turned to Cole. Cole stood. He had prepared no statement, no defense, no careful list of context or mitigating factors. He had decided, in the long night following his son's arrival, that the only offering he could bring to this council and to his pack was the unobstructed truth. He told it. He told them how the report about Nora's meetings had reached him and how he had processed it. He told them that he had not spoken to Nora before the assembly. He told them that he had given her no opportunity to explain, had presented no specific accusation in advance, had not afforded her the basic right to be heard that any pack member in any lesser situation would have received automatically. He told them about the iron. He told them, when he had discovered the truth, the exact night, the specific moment of reading Nora's notes alone in the dark of his office, and what that understanding had felt like, the particular quality of a realization that offers no comfort and permits no excuse. I was wrong, he said. I was wrong in a way that cannot be reduced or undone or made smaller by any explanation. I marked an innocent woman as a traitor and sent her out of her home and her community while she was carrying children I did not know existed, for a meeting she was having on my behalf, in my interest, with my pack's well-being as her only concern. Every consequence that followed, the collapse of the peace framework, the conflict with Fernwood, the years this pack spent diminished and less connected than it should have been, all of it has its root in that one night. I have known for 15 years that I was wrong. I did not find a way to say it publicly until my sons came here and gave me no option but to stand in this hall and face it. That delay is its own separate failure. I have no defense to offer for any part of it. He sat down. The hall stayed silent. The witnesses came after that. One by one, pack members who had been present on the night of the exile, or who had lived through the years that followed and understood their cost, came to speak. An elder who had privately disagreed with Cole's decision at the time, but had said nothing. A wolf whose brother had been injured in the Fernwood confrontations, and who spoke without bitterness, but with complete precision, about what that injury had meant for one family. A woman who had been a close friend of Nora's and who had left Hartwell Pack 3 years after the exile because she could not continue building her life in a community where what had been done to her friend was simply never honestly discussed. She had come back for the hearing. She had traveled for 2 days to be in this hall. Nora Vale was the finest Luna this pack ever had, she said, looking directly at Agatha, and then slowly around the room at every face. I want that said aloud in this hall, with every person here as a witness. Nobody in the hall said a word against it, because nobody could. Callum watched all of it from his seat. He kept his expression steady and his hands still, letting everything move through the room and settle where it needed to. Beside him, Owen was writing in the small notebook he had brought from Millhaven, recording the proceedings the way he recorded everything, with accuracy and without editorial. When the testimonies were complete, Agatha called for a recess, and the 7 elders withdrew to deliberate. The pack waited. Cole sat alone at the far end of the central space. No one approached him during the recess, and he did not look like a man who wanted company. He looked like a man sitting beneath the full weight of everything that had been spoken in this room, letting it press down on him without attempting to lift it. Callum considered going to him. He decided against it, not out of cruelty, but out of honesty. He was not ready to offer comfort he did not genuinely feel, and he was not willing to perform something he was not certain of. He had been raised on truth, and he had no intention of setting it aside for convenience, not even in this moment. Owen looked up from his notebook without being asked. He did not argue with any of it, he said quietly. No, Callum agreed. He did not. The elders returned after close to an hour. Agatha stood and addressed the hall for all of them. This council finds that the exile of Nora Vale was carried out without adequate investigation, without the person accused being given any opportunity to speak in her own defense, and without sufficient basis in evidence. The branding that accompanied the exile was an act of severe and irreversible punishment applied under these same conditions. Both actions were in direct contradiction of the standards of justice that this pack exists to uphold, and both are formally recorded as such. She paused. This council further finds that the leadership of Hartwell Pack since that event, while not without genuine achievement in certain areas, has been fundamentally shaped by a decision that weakened this pack's position, its relationships with neighboring territories, and the internal confidence of its community. The Alpha bears full responsibility for these consequences. Another pause, and this one was felt by every person in the room. On the question of succession raised by Callum and Owen Vale, this council recognizes their standing under pack law and their right to be heard. Having heard them, and having observed them during the 3 days of this process, the council offers the following recommendation to the pack. The hall was holding its breath. We recommend that Callum and Owen Vale be formally acknowledged as sons of Alpha Cole Hartwell and full members of Hartwell Pack, with all the rights and standing that status carries. We recommend that a formal public clearing of Nora Vale's name be conducted with the complete pack in attendance, and that the branding be formally recorded in the pack's permanent history as an act of injustice. And we recommend that questions of leadership structure be put to a full pack vote, with the available options being continuation of Cole Hartwell as sole alpha, transition of leadership to one or both of his sons, or a shared leadership arrangement to be defined by the council. She looked at Callum and Owen with the calm, steady gaze of someone who has earned the right to deliver important things. The council does not make this decision for the pack. The pack makes it for itself. The vote was held the following morning. Every adult member was given time to speak privately with an elder if they had questions. No pressure was applied from any direction. The morning was quiet and serious in the way that genuinely important mornings tend to be. Cole made no case for himself. He made no public statement, held no private conversations that were designed to influence anything. He sat in his office and waited, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing he had done in 17 years. The elders counted the votes. Agatha brought the result to the hall that afternoon. The pack has voted for a shared structure, she announced. Cole Hartwell to step into an elder advisory capacity, Callum and Owen Vale to serve as joint alphas of Hartwell Pack, with full leadership authority, effective at the next full moon. The response in the hall was not a cheer exactly. It was something with more relief in it. The particular sound of a community that has been living under the weight of an unresolved wrong and has finally found its way through to the other side of it. The full moon ceremony was held 3 weeks later, on a clear, cold night that felt, to every wolf standing in the open ground outside the pack house, like the kind of night that insists on being remembered. The pack had gathered in a wide circle, torchlight moving over hundreds of faces turned toward the center. Callum and Owen stood there, 2 men who had grown up outside these borders, and were now, by the will of the community and the weight of their bloodline, about to step into the center of them. Before the ceremony began, Agatha addressed the pack. She spoke Nora's name clearly and without hesitation. She described what Nora had done for Hartwell Pack, the peace framework she had been building, the careful work of a woman who had been trying to protect people who would ultimately fail to protect her. She described the branding and the exile, calling them what the council had formally determined: unjust, irreversible, and a mark of this pack's failure to live according to its own stated values. She said that the pack's record would be corrected. She said that Nora Vale's record as Luna of Hartwell would reflect the truth of what she had been and what she had given. Then she said, "This pack owes that woman more than any ceremony can carry, but this is what we have tonight, and we give it honestly and without reservation." Cole stood at the edge of the circle, visible to the full pack, in a position that carried no honor and required no performance, just presence, just accountability made visible. He had understood, when Callum asked him to stand there, Exactly what was being asked, and why. He had agreed without discussion. He stood there for the full ceremony and did not look away from any part of it. Callum received his alpha mantle from the elders with the steadiness that had been his defining quality since the day he was born. No flourish, no performance. Just a man stepping into something he had spent his life preparing for. Owen received his with a brief, private pause, a moment of internal acknowledgement that was entirely his own, and then he straightened and the thing was done. When the circle began to open, and the pack moved toward each other, in the way that communities do after something important has happened, and they need to be among each other, Callum took out his phone. He called Nora. She answered on the second ring. "It is done," he said. He heard her breathe. "Are you all right?" she asked. Not what happened. Not are you alpha now. Are you all right? Yes, he said. We are both all right. A pause. Then, Owen too? He looked across the clearing to where his brother was standing with Gerald, the two of them in deep, quiet conversation. Owen's notebook already open in his hand, because Owen was always working, always recording, always making sure that what mattered was preserved accurately. Owen too. Another pause. Then Nora said, with the kind of calm that her sons had grown up understanding, was not the absence of feeling, but its fullest and most disciplined expression, "Good." Callum said, "Will you come?" The silence that followed was long enough that he waited without pressing. He had learned that from her, the ability to hold space for someone without filling it with your own need. She said, "I need some time. Take whatever you need." "I will come," she said. "When I am ready, I will come." He believed her completely. He stood in the clearing after the call ended, looking up at the moon. It was full and white, and, unlike the moon on the night his mother had walked out of this place 17 years ago, it did not feel indifferent. It felt attentive. It felt like something that had been keeping track. Nora came 6 weeks later. She drove herself, arriving on a quiet weekday morning while the pack was going about its ordinary business. She parked at the edge of the clearing and stood beside the car for a moment, looking at the pack house. It was exactly as she had described it to her sons over the years. It was also entirely different, in the way that places are different when you return to them carrying a version of yourself that the place has never met before. Owen knew she was coming before anyone told him. He had a particular awareness of things in motion, of people moving toward each other, of situations developing beneath the surface of what was visible. He had told Callum that morning that their mother would arrive before noon. At 11:47, she stepped out of her car and walked into the clearing. They came to meet her together. She looked at them in the clear morning light, both of them standing side by side as alphas of the pack they had been born to lead, and she did the thing that her sons had seen perhaps 4 times in their entire lives. Her face moved in a way that had nothing to do with composure. Callum held her first. Owen put his hand on her shoulder and then, when Callum stepped back, held her in turn, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, the way she had when he was very small, and the world had been very large and very hard. When she pulled back, she was composed again, steady in the way that was simply who she was. She looked at them both with clear eyes. "Show me around," she said. Cole found her in the garden at the back of the pack house that afternoon. She was looking at the plants along the stone wall, the same plants that had been growing there when she was Luna, 17 years older now, overgrown in places and improperly tended. She heard him coming and gave herself a moment before she turned. He looked older. Of course he did. So did she. He looked like a man who had been living with something very heavy for a very long time, which was exactly what he was. He said, "Thank you for letting them come." "I did not stop them," she said. "There is a difference." He accepted this without argument. Then he said, "I am sorry, Nora. I know those words are not enough. I know there is no word in the language that names what I owe you, but they are true." She looked at him for a moment. What she felt was not what she had prepared herself to feel over the years. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was not warmth, but it was not hatred either. It was the recognition of a man who had done a catastrophic wrong and had lived inside its consequences long enough to understand what he had done without any room left for excuse. That was not nothing. It did not undo any of what it needed to undo, but it was not nothing. "I know," she said. "I know you are sorry." She looked at her wrist for a moment, then she looked back at him. I am not here for you, Cole. I am here because my sons lead this pack, and this is their home, and that makes it mine. I am going to build something here on my own terms. If you can respect that, we can share this space without making it harder than it needs to be. Cole said, I can respect that. Good. She turned back to the garden. These need proper attention, she said. Whoever has been tending the lavender has no idea what they are doing. Cole was quiet for a moment. Something in him almost became a sound. Not quite. I will leave you to it, he said. He walked back toward the pack house. Nora stood alone in the garden with the overgrown plants and the old stone wall and the sky above Hartwell territory, which was the same sky as everywhere else, wide and blue and without any particular preference about what happened below it. She pressed one hand flat against the rough stone. She thought about Millhaven, about the house by the stream, and Claire, and June, and Dr. Halford, and the long accumulation of ordinary days that had built themselves, without anyone giving them permission, into a real and solid life. She thought about the notebook with "Start Over" written at the top of a page and 2 names below it, and how those words had turned out to be not a plan exactly, but a direction, and how the direction had been true. She thought about her sons, who were somewhere in the pack house right now doing the hard, daily work of making a community worth belonging to. The pride she felt was the kind that cannot be adequately put into words. She did not try. She pulled her sleeves down and began assessing what the garden needed. There was a great deal to do, which was fine. She had always worked best when there was something in front of her worth working toward. In the weeks that followed, Nora settled into the healer's practice without fanfare. Pack members came slowly at first, uncertain how to approach a woman whose story they had grown up hearing in pieces. She received them the way she had always received anyone who needed care, without ceremony and without requiring explanation. Within a month, they came steadily. Within 2, she had more patients than she had expected, and a waiting list she had not anticipated. Gerald came on the 3rd week. He sat across from her in the consultation room and told her about the step he had not taken, the way he had rehearsed telling it to himself for 17 years. He did not come for absolution. She could see that clearly. He came because he needed to say it to her face, and she needed to hear it from his. That was its own kind of completion, and both of them understood that without saying so. Callum and Owen ran the pack with a clarity that made the work look more natural than it was. They governed differently, Callum more direct and forward-moving, Owen more watchful and considered, and they had spent a lifetime learning to use those differences as tools. The pack adjusted to them, with a speed that surprised no one who had watched them during the 3 days of the council process. The community had been ready for something worth adjusting to. Now it had it. Cole fulfilled his advisory role with a quiet diligence that earned him a kind of respect he had not expected and had not asked for. He answered questions when they were put to him. He provided historical context when the council needed it. He did not offer opinions that had not been invited and did not attempt to shape decisions that were no longer his to make. It was a smaller version of the life he had lived as Alpha, and he carried it without complaint, because complaint would have been a kind of dishonesty he had decided he was no longer willing to engage in. On a quiet evening in early spring, several months after her return, Nora was sitting in the garden she had spent weeks restoring. The yarrow was properly tended. The lavender stood in correctly spaced rows. She had added chamomile along the far wall and a wide patch of calendula near the garden gate that caught the late afternoon light and burned orange and gold in it. The garden had become her own. She had come out on her first morning back and seen it as it was, overgrown and improperly tended, and had made the decision quietly and without announcement that she was going to restore it. She had ordered seeds from Millhaven, rearranged the beds according to healer's logic, and worked at it steadily every day she could spare. It had also become the place where pack members came to find her when they were not quite ready to come to the healer's house directly. She had noticed early that people who did not want to walk through a formal door would drift to the garden gate instead, lean on it, ask how the calendula was coming along, and then gradually say what they had actually come to say. She welcomed it. It was how she had always worked best. Cole came occasionally, not often and not with any particular intention, but she would hear him approaching along the side path, and he would stop at the gate, and they would speak for a few minutes about something practical, and then he would go back inside. It was a kind of conversation that both of them understood the limits of, and neither pushed beyond. It was not warmth, but it was not cold. It was two people with a long and difficult history, learning how to share space honestly. Owen came and sat beside her on the bench, without announcing himself, which he never needed to do, because she always heard him coming regardless. He did not say anything for a while. She waited. Callum had been the one who talked to her every day, sometimes twice, quick calls about practical things, and then longer conversations in the evenings, when the pack's business for the day was handled, and he had time to simply be her son, rather than the alpha. Owen came less frequently, but in a different way, arriving when he had something specific on his mind, that he had been working through, and was ready to speak, and those conversations were worth waiting for, because Owen did not say things carelessly. He did not say anything for a while. She waited, looking at the garden. Then he said, "Are you glad you came back?" Nora looked at the garden. She looked at the sky. She looked at the lights beginning to appear in the windows of the pack house as the evening deepened, the warm and ordinary light of a community moving through the end of its day, the specific warmth of a place that had people in it who belonged to each other. She thought about the question seriously. Owen deserved a serious answer. She thought about what it had cost her to come back, not the practical things, but the internal ones. The act of walking onto Hartwell land again. The act of standing in the garden on her first morning and deciding she was going to restore it, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it needed doing, and she was the one who knew how. The act of sitting with Gerald in the healer's house and watching something shift in his face when she told him she had never blamed the pack as a whole, only the decision. She thought about Callum and Owen somewhere inside the pack house right now, doing the daily work of making a community function and be worthy of the people in it. She was proud of them every single day, in a way that had not changed or diminished since the morning they were born. "Yes," she said. "I am." Owen nodded. He opened his notebook and wrote something she did not try to read. She leaned back on the bench and looked up at the stars, beginning to appear above the tree line. The sky above Hartwell was the same sky as above Millhaven, which was the same sky as everywhere else, the same stars in the same positions, indifferent and consistent and vast. She had looked at this sky at 17 and at 27, and on the night she walked out of this place, and on every night after that for 17 years. It had never once arranged itself differently for her particular benefit, and she had always found that honest quality more comforting than any version of the sky that paid special attention to her troubles would have been. The scar on her wrist caught the last pale light of the day. Two crossed lines, white and permanent, exactly where they had always been. She did not look away from them. She did not cover them. She had long since stopped feeling any need to explain them to anyone who noticed, and nobody who noticed ever failed to understand, looking at them, that something had happened to this woman, and that she had not allowed it to finish her. She had worn them uncovered through the full moon ceremony. She had worn them uncovered at every public gathering she had attended in Hartwell, at the communal meals and the council sessions she occasionally sat in on, at Callum's request, and the morning walks she took along the pack's east boundary, where she was sometimes joined by other early risers. Nobody had asked about them. Everybody had seen them. The pack had made its peace with what they meant. She was still working on her own. Some days the peace came easily. Other days it was more work. She had decided, a long time ago in a small room in Millhaven, that she was not going to measure her recovery by the easy days, but by the honest ones. The honest days were the ones that counted, the days when she felt the full weight of what had happened, and chose, with full knowledge of that weight, to keep going anyway. Those days she was certain she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her sons were inside the pack house they now led. The community she had once quietly shaped was finding its way back to something better and more honest than it had been. The garden was in the best order it had been in many years, and it would be better still by the end of the season. She was here, present, unbroken, and entirely herself. That was not a small thing. That was, in every way that truly mattered, everything.